we are doing a project. We have a new subdivision, a new commercial project. So how do we determine what we need to do? And this is not a real simple process. So ecology went to the extent of creating a flow chart to try to help us, the proponents, determine what to do, what minimum requirements to provide, how to get from place to place. And so I have a copy of the flow chart here. I know it's it's small. You go to our manual, you can see a nice big copy of it. But as with all flow charts, you start in the upper left-hand corner. So I'm up here in the upper left-hand corner. And my first question is a question to determine which way we're going with our reviews. Are we following the UIC rule? And if we're following the UIC rule, we follow the UIC rule. Or are we not following the UIC rule? And if that's the case, then we are following the core elements, and we are following only the core elements. And that is that's a big piece when we start getting into determining runoff treatment. So if we are following the UIC rule, we go to chapter 5.6 in the manual and follow what the UIC rule says to do. And we read all those various different sections. I think there's more than 14. I think there's 20 some sections in section 5.6. The important ones are near the end, but we follow that rule in its entirety. Or if we answer no to that question, now we are following the core element process. And all the information in chapter 5.6 is no longer available to you. It's moot. It's non-existent as far as you're concerned once you answer no to this question. Okay, so now, does the project meet the definition of new development? And we really don't have a definition for new development in Eastern Washington. There's a definition, and it talks about the fact that you're putting in properties on areas that have not been substantially developed. But then that leaves a question about what does it mean to be substantially developed? In Western Washington, that definition is 35% impervious. A project that is currently 35% impervious, we consider to be a site for redevelopment. If there's less than 35%, it's new development. Now, you can argue with that 35% number. Where'd that come from? It comes from the idea that land that's more than 35% impervious causes significant damage to the receiving waters. And so we have an area of a exemption essentially in Western Washington, where if there's properties that were more than 40% impervious in 1985, they don't have to meet the pre-developed conditions of forest. They meet existing conditions because they're already in quite bad shape, and we're trying to do what we can to help them. So we don't have a strict definition. Each jurisdiction can create their own definition of where it goes between new and redevelopment. But whatever that definition is, you have to use it jurisdiction-wide. And so I'm going to answer no to that question right now. And that says that core elements 1 through 4, number 8, are required for the entire project site. So all the new impervious that you're placing, everything you're doing on that site, you have to go through and evaluate what those core elements ask you to do and do those things for that project site. For example, if you have it in a commercial site and you got to do core element 3, you need to apply source controls to that commercial site. So you have to say we're going to do sweeping on a regular basis, because sweeping is a mandatory operational source control for commercial sites. So now we got to find out what we're going to do with 5, 6, and 7. So this is where the secondary thresholds come in. So now core element 5, we're over here at the left-hand side, going down. So now is there more than 5,000 square feet of pollution generating impervious surface? And if not, you don't have to do core element 5. If yes, you now would find out, is this a high use site or are they meeting full dispersion? And if it is not a high use site and is full dispersion, then core element is not 5, not required. But if you are not doing full dispersion and it is a high use site, then you have to do core element 5 and 7. 5 being treatment, 7 being O&M for the new PGIS. You need to go to the glossary to get the definition of what that means. So let's go through this for a second. I have a project with 13,000 square feet of new impervious surface. And my building is 9,000 square feet. And that's pollution, non-pollution generating impervious surface. And that leaves me with 4,000 square feet of parking. Kind of a crazy relationship, but yes, if I only have 4,000 square feet of parking, I don't have to do treatment. I don't have to do core element 5 because I don't have more than 5,000 square feet of PGIS. So once we've answered those questions, we got to look at core element 6. And core element 6 has, does the project add greater than 10,000 square feet of impervious surface? No acknowledgement of pollution generating or not pollution generating. So that project with 13,000 square feet would have to do core element 6 and 7. Core element 7 being operation and maintenance for whatever BMP you're installing. But if you had 5,000 square feet of building and 8,000 square feet of parking, you would have to do treatment because that site could be considered, you'd have to look at the high use site definition, but that site could be considered a high use site. So you want to follow this flow chart. You as a reviewer should have the applicant, the proponent, tell you how they went through this flow chart. Follow their path and have them show you how they answered each of those questions. Particularly this question down here about full dispersion and not a high use site. And remember, full dispersion is a very specific BMP. They can't just be taking the runoff on their site and dispersing it on the site and assuming it's going to stay there. Full dispersion has a ratio of 6.5 to 1 of dispersion area to impervious area. And it also has a maximum impervious area of 10% of the project site. So that is a very specific BMP that they must be following in order to get a yes answer on that question. We have a similar flow chart that's quite a bit more convoluted than the new development flow chart. This is for redevelopment. Again, we have the same starting question about class 5 UIC wells. And then does the project site meet the definition for new development? And if yes, we should have stayed on that old one. No, we're on this one now. So we start out by requiring core elements 2 and 3 for the entire project site. And 1, 4, and 8 are required for the new and replaced impervious areas. So we have some existing surface in there that we have to deal with. And core elements 2 and 3 have to apply to the existing surface as well as the new and replaced. So now we go to core element number 5, and we have to look at this separately between new impervious area and replaced impervious. So each of those have to come into play as we work our way through this. And then we look at 5,000 square feet of new and replaced. And then we have that same deciding point here. And then we come down here and identify, are we required for new and replaced PGIS areas? So now, how do we define replaced impervious surface? There's a definition in the glossary for replaced impervious surface in Eastern Washington. So you need to look at that definition. It's not identical to that of Western Washington. And we have the same kind of breakout over here for new and replaced, only that the new impervious surface has the secondary threshold. Specifically, the replaced impervious surface only has to do flow control if required by some other jurisdictions or the state or federal. So that kind of, when you get to a replaced redevelopment project, things get a little crazy. And so as a jurisdiction, you need to be careful about how you define what are replaced impervious surfaces and work your way safely through those. And what you define as a redevelopment threshold for what's going on. Now, I probably don't need to give you this next slide, but I'm going to show the next slide here. And these are the 8 core elements. So 1, 2, 3, and 4 are essentially layout, services during construction, and source control. And source control applies to commercial and industrial projects, but it doesn't apply to single family residential. It is in the manual, core element 2, all the information about construction stormwater pollution prevention plan, and core element 3, the source control, are in the manual because the construction permit and the industrial permit and the sand and gravel permit all point to the manual as the place to get information on how to meet ACART, how to identify treatment BMPs. So we have them in the manual, particularly for those permits, those general permits, but they do apply for the municipal permit as well. And the municipal permit does refer to them in Appendix 1. So we talked a little bit about runoff treatment and flow control. Operation and maintenance has to do if you are putting any kind of BMP for runoff treatment or flow control, you need to have the operation and maintenance manuals for those, and those need to be included in the jurisdiction's O&M plan. And core element 8 is for local requirements. There was, when we did our 2019 manual, there was a little bit of desire to include those local jurisdiction requirements in the stormwater manual, as opposed to core element 8. That has some problems in that if we put them in the manual, they are there for 5 years or until the manual is updated. And the local jurisdictions may want to change those requirements more frequently than once every 5 years on the schedule of ecology. So we felt that those local requirements fit well within a core element, that the jurisdictions could have specific requirements that would be, and the proponent would be forced to look at those local requirements in order to meet core element number 8. So these core elements are things like identifying portions of the system where flow control is not required, identifying places of the system where basic treatment is adequate, identifying portions of the system where you had to meet higher standards than the manual calls for. Those were all placed in the local requirements, and the local jurisdictions have complete control over those local requirements. Now, we tried to help identify what level of treatment is needed. We recognize the fact that we have different levels of treatment. We have basic treatment, which is TSS removal. We have metals treatment, which is treatment of dissolved copper and zinc. And we have phosphorus treatment, and we also have oil control. And they all have different definitions of when they're needed. So we created this flow control or this treatment flow chart to kind of help identify what's going on. So the first up in the upper left-hand corner, we're asking if they trigger core element number 5, which means they have more than 5,000 square feet of pollution generating impervious surface, and they meet the ADT roadways and parking area definition or the high use site definition. If that's the case, then they need to do basic metals and oil control. All right, automatically, they got to do those. If they don't, then we're saying, well, here's some other sites that have definitions in the manual that you need to look at specifically. And if your answer is yes to those, then you have to do basic and metals. If the answer no to those, you only have to do basic treatment. So here's an easy way to determine what the initial levels of treatment you have to do. And then all 3 of those take you to a single point where now you have to look to see if you have to do phosphorus treatment. And phosphorus treatment is determined by where the water goes. Basic and metals and oil treatment are determined by the land use. Phosphorus treatment determined by where the water goes. So if you're not going to a water body that has phosphorus treatment requirements, you don't have to add phosphorus treatment, but you still have to do the level of treatment that's been identified in the middle of this drawing. Now that you know what kind of treatment you have to do, what BMPs can do that treatment? Well, you come to this table. Okay. If you're doing subsurface infiltration, that's UIC. Okay. If you're doing that, you go to the UIC wells and you follow their treatment requirements, which are identified in some matrices in chapter 5.6. Okay. Subsurface infiltration is not a portion of the core elements. Okay, you're not getting it that way. You're not getting treatment that way. Now we have other ways of doing it. Evaporation ponds, you're not discharge, you're full dispersant. There's no discharge anywhere, so you don't have to do any treatment. If you're going to a CSO, combined sewer overflows, you need to follow local regs for CSOs. Pretty straightforward. If you're directing to surface infiltration, meaning an infiltration pond, for example, you have to go down. If oil control is required, you have to apply one of these. Then you come down here. Then you have to do pre-treatment prior to infiltration. And then you have to apply the infiltration BMP. If you're directing to surface water, you now go down through this process down the middle. You have to determine, are you the phosphorus limited water body or not? That helps determine what you're going to do. If you have to do oil control, if on the previous chart here, you had to do oil control up here, then you go down and identify what you're going to do for oil control. And then you continue back into the middle process. If you didn't have to do oil control, you go down. Now is phosphorus treatment required? If it is, you do a phosphorus treatment. And then you go on down to see, was metal treatment required? If it was required, you have to make sure you get metals treatment. And then you're done. You're done because metals treatment also gives you basic treatment. If you're using a metals treatment BMP, you also get basic treatment. And if you're using a phosphorus treatment BMP, you also get basic treatment. So your selection's done over here if you had to do phosphorus. If you didn't have to do phosphorus, now you're looking for metals treatment. You come on through here, pick which one you want, and your selection's done. If you didn't have to do metals treatment, here you go with your basic treatment BMPs. And in every case, you have to do at least basic treatment if you're discharging the surface waters. And notice every one of these, the bottom bullet is emerging tech. Those are tape requirements. Those are BMPs that have been approved through the tape review process and are online on the tape website. Those have GULDs, general use level designations, for certain types of treatment. And if you design that tape BMP, that storm filter, or that Filtera, or that biopod, whichever BMP you're choosing, you design that in accordance with the flow requirements, the design criteria, and you get it approved by the manufacturer as being an appropriate design, then it can meet the level of treatment that we show on this flow chart. So we do have some footnotes over here to help decide what's going on, particularly if you're using the treatment basin, the existing soils to provide treatment, you need to meet the site suitability criteria for the soils.